And a happy Friday to one and all. This is episode 104 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this late Friday afternoon here in New York. If you're checking out episode 104 on the YouTube channel or enjoying the content, haven't done so already, click like, subscribe, comment, flip on those notifications. Or if you're catching up with this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same rule applies. Click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. So this is going to be part 3, and it could be endless parts. It's just a matter of what you all respond to and the kind of content that you like. But this will be the third in a continuing series of the best movie you've never seen. And today's movie isn't really that old. The movie I did the other day, Dead of Night, is a horror film that is now almost 80 years old. Well, this movie comes from my single favorite movie year ever, 1993. And it is a comedy film, a horror film, and another movie I mentioned and discussed how Get Shorty is, and this was yesterday, a movie within a movie and has a lot of kind of in-jokes about the movie business and how the movie business worked in the 90s and all of this sort of stuff. Well, today's movie, Joe Dante's amazing comedy horror film, Matinee, is the film that I'm going to be discussing. And I would say that I'm a lot more confident that no one has seen this movie, or I should say a very low percentage of people who would tune into this have seen this movie, because it was a film that got fantastic critical reviews upon release. 93% Rotten Tomatoes if you check it out right now. And features, for my money, the single best performance of John Goodman, an Oscar-nominated actress, but the best performance actor, sir. Goodman in this era was not playing. He played some leads like he did the movie The Babe, but man, it was good casting visually, but if you're going to make a movie about Babe Ruth, you got to do it better. It was so bad. And Goodman gave the best that he had. It was terrible. In that same era, he made the movie Matinee, which I call it a horror film. It's not really a horror film. It's more of a kind of loving homage to old school science fiction films that Hollywood put out in the 50s and 60s. And it has kind of horror film elements because the movie within the movie is like a Jeff Goldblum, The Fly type of a film called Mant. But it's a movie that the people I know who have seen it, and it kind of got a little traction at a certain point in the 90s where people started to talk it up, but it's rarely free on streaming. I don't recall it ever being on Netflix or ever streaming free on Amazon Prime for that matter, even though it is a film with a recognizable lead actor in Goodman who's done so much great work in every genre, going all the way back to the days where he was Revenge of the Nerds and has scenes of apoplectic meltdown. But it is very much a below the radar classic. Certainly I would expect that anyone under 35 has not seen this movie because it has not been all over streaming. As I mentioned, even movies from Alfred Hitchcock, such as Psycho and The Birds, when something of an older vintage is on Netflix and people know that there is name recognition, even young people are more likely to check it out. Well, let's see what Psycho is all about. I've read about it. I watched Bates Motel, but I've never seen it, whatever it might be. But Matinee just hasn't gotten that kind of coverage. And it's not the sort of movie that anybody would be sort of saying, well, I've kind of always wanted to see this, like a Psycho or like The Birds. Because most people under 35 haven't heard of it in the first place, unless they happen to be a Joe Dante fan or what we would call a John Goodman completist. But this movie, Goodman, who plays the lead, it is a period piece. And as I always say, if a period piece is done right, it is timeless. As I've argued, Chariots of Fire, a movie set between 1920 and 1924, made in 1980-81, it is timeless. Matinee is also timeless. It is set during a very heavy, serious, potentially planet-killing time in American history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It doesn't sound like it would be a comedy, does it? But it is a comedy on the strength of Goodman's performance and his character, who is a genius, a brilliant promoter. And Goodman plays a movie producer, the word that they used to use a lot to describe someone like this, whether it was in the movie business, whether it was someone in the entertainment, a different entertainment field like sports, an owner like the famous sports owner Bill Veeck, Veeck as in wreck, that he owned the Cleveland Indians, and he had these crazy promotions like Disco Demolition Night. The word that would be used to describe Goodman's character in this film, impresario. And that is not a word that is in common usage. In fact, I feel like this is the first time I'm hearing the word out loud in decades. But Goodman plays a successful, the kind of movie producer who is making movies that are not as good as his brain, that he is he's aiming at a lower level to turn a profit as opposed to, he's going low when he has the ability to go high. Sort of like Mel Brooks when he was told a million years ago that his movies were vulgar, and Brooks famously said, "My films rise below vulgarity." Lawrence Woolsey is a guy who is smarter than the movies he's making, but the trick with him is the gimmicks that he brings to the table to help sell the film. Now, the character of Lawrence Woolsey did not exist in a vacuum. He was not entirely a concocted creation for this movie, much the same way that later in the 90s, Barry Levinson, phenomenal filmmaker, made a movie with a huge cast, including Dustin Hoffman and Bobby De Niro, Mr. De Niro, Bobby D, who had just worked together, even though they only had maybe one or two scenes. In Sleepers, another Barry Levinson film, again, this is not an accident. None of this shit occurs in a vacuum. But they made a movie called Wag the Dog, where if you didn't know anything about the characters, you say, well, this movie is a black comedy, it's a satire, it's a farce. And the character Dustin Hoffman plays is so absurd. Like, who would even come up with an idea to have a character like this? Well, nobody. It's based on Robert Evans, a famous producer, one of the greatest producers in the history of Hollywood, and a real character. There's a name to Google, Robert Evans, right? Chinatown, Marathon Man. He was involved with The Godfather. He might have even been involved in Rosemary's Baby, which I was going to mention. But Robert Evans was a character, a guy who was always had a very kind of deep tan. He spoke in a very particular way. And one of the reasons why they said that Dustin Hoffman was not going to win Best Actor that year, because the movie is not that good. I think it falls apart in the last half hour, despite the strength of the performances. It's kind of, the movie is arguing that fixers that work in the White House are actually the most powerful people in the world. I don't really think that that was the case in the 90s or today, but Hoffman's performance was so good that he got nominated for Best Actor. There was talk he should win, but then the other side said, he's just doing a feature-length impersonation of his old buddy, Robert Evans. They can't give him the award. They worked together in Marathon Man 20 years earlier. Is it safe? No, it's not. It's not safe. It's very dangerous. John Goodman's character, Lawrence Woolsey, is directly, not even indirectly, he is clearly based on a famous B-movie producer who was way more intelligent than most of the films that he put forth, a man by the name of William Castle. And oddly enough, despite the success that William Castle had throughout, the kind of prime of his career, the 50s and 60s, right in the era that this movie takes place, the early 1960s, Cuban Missile Crisis. William Castle was famous for gimmicks and doing weird shit to promote his movies to get people excited. But the best movie he was ever involved with came towards the latter part of his career, where he actually produced and was one of the key people producing Rosemary's Baby, which to this day, you will find people saying it is the best horror movie ever made. I would certainly say it's in the top 10. And for sustained tension, you're talking about a movie that is now more than 50 years old, 56 years old, based on an incredible best-selling novel by Ira Levin, who Stephen King once described as the Swiss watchmaker of suspense novels. That is high praise. But Ira Levin was a master, and Rosemary's Baby is a great book. The movie is just as good. And William Castle actually has a kind of a cameo in the movie, which reminds me of a kind of a ridiculous true story. In the days before everything was on the internet, when, for example, a college student would get asked a question, or a college course, a class of students would be asked a question, either you knew the answer or you didn't know the answer. You couldn't Google it and 10 seconds later spit out an answer or be at your computer and going like this to try to impress the professor. So we were watching in the class called Color and Cinema. Oddly enough, not the horror film. We didn't see Rosemary's Baby. That was the year earlier in 94. But in 1995, the spring semester, 29 years ago, I watched Rosemary's Baby in the class called Color and Cinema because I remember there was an amazing use of the color green. Everything is fucking green in Rosemary's Baby. Everything is green. Because everything's green. You know, Roman Polanski was obsessed with the color green or whatever. I don't remember. But we watched Rosemary's Baby, and I had seen it once before, but I had not seen it projected on a big screen with an audience, 25, 30 other students, the professor, Joe McElhaney, brilliant guy. Anyway, the movie is going, and there's a scene in the film where Mia Farrow's Rosemary is in a phone booth, and she's freaking out because she knows that something is not right with her pregnancy and my husband this and that and the other thing. And there appears to be a man outside the phone booth, like with gray hair, menacing her. And we think that it's the Sidney Blackmer character of Roman Castevet, another fantastic name. There's so many great names in these movies I've talked about. We think it's going to be that guy, but it's not. It's some other gray-haired guy. And Professor McElhaney paused the movie, something he didn't really do very often, because some professors would pause a movie and then give us 10 minutes of lecture, like cock-blocking the movie. Happened more frequently than you would like. In this instance, Professor Mac paused the movie and said, hey, for bonus points, but not really bonus points, just because I'm curious. Does anyone know who that guy is who we think is going to be Roman? And it's just some random guy standing outside the phone booth. Somewhere in the deepest recesses of my still addled, agitated, antisocial, incel, feel free to stop me if you think I'm embarrassing myself too much. But somewhere in the deepest recesses of my consciousness, a name popped up. William Castle. Somewhere along the line, probably years before I got to film school, I was reading a book that must have talked about Rosemary's Baby. It might have been a book on cult movies or something. Greatest horror movies. But the name William Castle materialized in the furthest recesses of time and space and my medulla oblongata. And without even editing myself or checking to say, I don't really know if this is the right answer, if I'm just conjuring nonsense here, I blurted out, that's William Castle, right? Professor McElhaney smiled. William Castle, producer, or one of the producers of this film. How did you know that? I don't have any fucking idea, to be honest with you. I didn't say fucking idea, but I said, I don't know. I feel like I must have read it somewhere and it made sense that it was him. I don't even recall if I had seen a picture of him. But there are certain questions that we get asked in life which are not there's a reason why we're being asked. And I knew that it was going to be somebody that we had studied, and we had discussed William Castle briefly in class, not this class, but prior to this. His name had come up. Anyway, I threw it out there. It ended up being right. The character that Goodman plays, Lawrence Woolsey, has this movie, in the movie Matinee, he has this movie called Mant, this The Fly, Jeff Goldblum kind of story that he's promoting, and it just so happens he descends on the Florida Keys to screen the film with this wacky promotion that he's come up with where he's going to have actors dressed as actors from the movie, and it's all this nonsense. It wouldn't work now. The Cuban Missile Crisis is about to happen. The main character in the movie, a kid named Gene, his father is deployed to Cuba. And all of this crazy shit is happening as John Goodman recruits this kid, he likes him, to help him promote the movie. But when you're watching the film, you're thinking of, did the world end in 1962? Like, what the fuck? Because everything reaches a fever pitch. And Goodman is loving every second. There are certain times where you see an actor in a role just licking his chops because he knows he's unlikely to get this kind of part again. And his character is so unique and so funny and different and distinctive. The way that he has the cigar. William Castle was famous for never not having a cigar in his mouth or in his hand. So Goodman's character has that. The real William Castle came up with some really crazy gimmicks. So, for example, he did this horror film. Stephen King talked about this in one of his books, Dance Macabre, for reference. He thought it was a fucking scream. Stephen King watched a lot of movies while under the influence of drugs and weed and all kinds of substances in his younger days. And he talks about this movie that William Castle produced called The Tingler. The Tingler, ooh. And Stephen King was trying, as he's explaining it, Dance Macabre is a nonfiction book. He says, as far as I can tell, whatever this monster was, and I'm not sure it was really a monster, it kind of wrapped itself around you, and it sort of tingled you to death. Whatever that means, it tingled you to death. So William Castle would go into movie theaters before screenings. And we see this in the movie Matinee, where John Goodman and Kathy Moriarty, a great actress, she played Jake LaMotta's wife in Raging Bull, and she's been in a ton of other movies in Copland. She was even on a sitcom with Andrew Dice Clay called Bless This House. She's always great. She plays John Goodman's in the movie, Lawrence Woolsey's assistant, lover, friend, whatever. But the kid is working with John Goodman's character, Lawrence Woolsey, to set the theater up for the big premiere. And we don't know exactly what he's doing. We just know that the kid is not going to tell anybody, and he knows what's going on. He might be concerned about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he's excited to be working with this guy whose work he knows. He's a big horror film fan, and this movie that Goodman has produced, is horror, and he can't wait to see it. So we don't get the particulars of exactly this scheme and the gimmick that they're doing, but we know they're planning something wacky. So William Castle, while promoting and making this movie called The Tingler, he figured out an idea, how to strap some kind of contraption to the backs of the theater seats. And it's just so stupid, but this is what he did. You get to a certain point of the movie where the tingler, or whatever the fuck it was tingling someone to death. You would be sitting in your chair and you would feel this like really creepy tingling sensation down your spine. That's the kind of promotions William Castle did. Another movie he produced, you might be familiar, in the early 2000s, there was a film with Matthew Lillard, among others, called 13 Ghosts. That was a kind of remake, reboot of a William Castle classic from, I believe, the 50s. He worked with Vincent Price a lot. But in the world of the movie Matinee, you have multiple plot threads, multiple lines of action converging in what appears to be a disastrous situation developing in Cuba. And there are characters in the film that are prepared for the end of the world. If you remember a Brendan Fraser film with Alicia Silverstone from about 25 years ago and Christopher Walken, Blast from the Past, where people were building fallout shelters in case doomsday was approaching. Leave the world behind kind of gets into that a little. There are people who are survivalists that we're fully stocked. We can live down here for, 18 months or whatever it is. The movie Spies Like Us, that great moment where, the world's about to end, but we're going to be okay down here. There's a sequence in this movie Matinee where it appears that the shit has hit the proverbial fan. But luckily, someone's a survivalist, and at least 4 people are going to survive, the 5 people are going to survive the nuclear blast that's going to decimate the entire planet, and we've got plenty of food down here, and we'll just, come out maybe 12 months from now and see what's going on out there. We'll see if there's anybody still alive. Goodman, chomping on his cigar, chewing scenery left and right, just running shit. The story builds to this incredible, almost a dual climax, where it appears that the Cuban Missile Crisis is about to result in World War III. Concurrently with the gimmicks that Lawrence Woolsey and Gene, the kid, have put in place to scare the shit out of the audience. It appears that World War III has started during the screening. But it turns out it was all part of the act. And the Cuban Missile Crisis just happened to be taking place, because history tells us that did not result in World War III. But this unbelievable moment where real life is this, and here's the movie, and it appears the print is burning because, oh my God, we're all gonna die. We better get to a fallout shelter. There's a look on John Goodman's face, a look of almost self-satisfied glee. And if it's possible for somebody to have a look on their face, which is the equivalent of patting oneself on the back, Goodman has this look. And I've been a fan of his, as I say, for 4 decades. Not only is this the best performance of his career, but that smile, that look, and he doesn't break the fourth wall. He's not looking at the audience, I don't believe, but that smile and that look that he gives is magic. And you see this guy, the gears turning, and him giving this really distinctive comedic performance, but the character is not a figure of fun. He is a genius, he's unconventional, and he's into this sort of weird gimmickry, which was popular at the time, just as the real William Castle was famous for not just making movies, but getting the audience involved in the process. And this is something that you still see, like at the Madame Tussauds Museum, they have, what do they call it? 4-dimensional short films where, a la William Castle, you're sitting there watching the movie, and during the film, there's some kind of weird shit where if a character gets splashed with water shoots out of the seat in front of you and hits you in the head. Or if a character gets an electric shock, a la the Tingler, bzzz, you go, holy shit, what the hell was that? So this movie, Matinee, which I absolutely classify as a great film, is not available for free to stream on any service, unfortunately. But unlike other films, it is available to rent. You're just going to have to pay, $2 or $3, like with usual with Amazon Prime or Apple or some of the other platforms. But it is such a good-natured movie. It is so much fun. The period details are right. The soundtrack, I should point out, one of the best film composers of all time, I've mentioned him before, Jerry Goldsmith, does a score which is one of his best. And when I say one of his best, you're talking about the guy who came up with the iconic theme music for the original Alien with Ridley Scott. Some of the most phenomenal musical cues. He also did Star Trek, the motion picture, and Star Trek, the Next Generation. And some of the music from that, I would argue that what's called Ailea's theme, not the one from Legend of Zelda, but from Star Trek, the motion picture, is as beautiful a piece of film music as I've ever heard. And that was Jerry Goldsmith. Goldsmith did so many fantastic scores. The Total Recall score with Arnold is okay, but in my opinion, his score for First Night with Richard Gere and Sean Connery and Ben Cross, who I recently discussed on the podcast, unbelievable score. But the work that he does with Matinee is just so good. You can watch the opening credits of this movie. You can find it on YouTube just to hear that score. It's like there are elements of John Williams, and there are elements of James Horner and James Newton Howard, but it's all Jerry Goldsmith. It's all Jerry Goldsmith was older than all of those guys. He was active and churning out fantastic musical scores in the 60s. It is a great film. It unfortunately bombed at the box office. And I remember when it came out in spring of 93, I want to say that it came out in like March or April. I'm sorry, it came out in January. I'm just looking over here. It got really good reviews. And my guess is the studio didn't think that it was quite on the level where it could get Oscar nominations, because a movie of this quality, as we say, 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, usually doesn't get released in January. But I remember all of the New York papers, Newsday, New York Times, New York Post, Daily News, all gave it favorable reviews, and the reviews were very much the same. Goodman is fucking great. He is amazing in this role. And many of them mentioned, well, he's clearly playing a character based on William Castle. Much as 4 or 5 years later, well, Dustin Hoffman he's not playing a character based on Robert Evans. He might as well be Robert Evans. That's how much they did his hair and his makeup to resemble, because Dustin Hoffman doesn't look like Robert Evans, but he was basically mimicking that character. William Castle was not a huge man, a large man, as John Goodman. But I remember the film got great reviews, and Siskel and Ebert in their weekly review that week loved it. It might have made the 10 best list for one of them, but I'm not sure about that, because 93 was just a killer year. So many great movies put out by Hollywood that year, from Schindler's List on down, The Fugitive, In the Line of Fire, In the Name of the Father, Shadowlands, Searching for Bobby Fischer. Hell, Last Action Hero with Arnold. Most underrated film of Arnold's career, a movie that bombed at the box office, but was way better and is better even today than its reputation. But Matinee slots in there, but from a different angle, because it is a movie that critics were telling people to go see. You will love this movie. Roger Ebert said, this is one of the most charming films. I don't remember seeing a movie like this. It is so good. It has such a gentleness of spirit. And at the center, you have a great actor in John Goodman, just bringing it. The silliness with this schlock horror film that he's made, but he's convinced that it's not schlock. He comes across, no, this is great. This is not a piece of shit movie. This is fun. And I remember when the DVD was released, they actually had a featurette showing this absurd fly style horror film called Mant. Like every scene because we see shots from this movie in the film Matinee, and it's fucking stupid. The wife is going to call the police because he's turning into an ant, and he's sticking his paw out at her, which looks like an ant claw. Just everything in the movie works. And it is the kind of film that when it's over, you will be smiling, and you will not be able to stop smiling because of Goodman's performance. The kid, I don't remember the name of the actor who plays Gene, he's really good. And you see other young actors and actresses that appeared in later films like Independence. They say, wait a minute, this kid over here looks familiar. I feel like I know them. It was beautifully cast and perfectly executed. It's just unfortunate that sometimes in Hollywood, you have these movies that come out at the wrong time and just don't connect with audiences. Now today, it's different because of streaming, and movies that maybe didn't get a fair shake in theaters, they hit streaming and blow up. And we've seen it. We've seen movies that tanked at the box office and ended up making a ton of money on streaming, whether video on demand or people buying it, like The Flash. When it was on HBO Max, it ended up doing very well. Matinee is one of those treasures that I hope gets rediscovered. And here in my little corner of the internet and of cyberspace, I hope to get people interested in seeing this fantastic film with a great John Goodman performance, not necessarily most underrated, but this is the third in the continuing series of the best movie you've never seen, Joe Dante's 1993 under-the-radar classic, Matinee. And with that, we've reached the end of episode number 104 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you. I get myself so worked up, but I'd like to thank you all for sharing this experience of one of my favorite films from back in the day with you. And if you've caught this episode on the YouTube channel or enjoying the content, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, and flip on those notifications so you don't miss any episode drops. Or if you've caught up with this episode, maybe in the car, at the gym, while making dinner, or doing whatever it is you might be doing on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, which I very much appreciate, please click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode number 105 real soon. Till then, peace.